I think we've got a great opportunity to explore a really, really important issue tonight with a great panel. I want to encourage you to vigorously participate in the discussion after the presentations, and with the panel's permission, I might sort of give a cough or a warning or a nudge 5 minutes before the end just to try and bring us in on time. I know one of our panellists with great foresight suggested that climate change policy, I think the year before last, was a diabolical challenge. Well, internationally and nationally, we're in a diabolical mess trying to put climate policy into action right now, would be my carefully couched diplomatic analysis. So it's a really important time to have this discussion, and I congratulate the Energy Research Institute and Melbourne University on sponsoring this and your interest and attention to it. We're really fortunate. We've got 3 outstanding speakers to sow some seeds for our discussion tonight. Professor Ross Garnaut needs no introduction, and in fact, Ross, I hope I was quoting you correctly, or roughly correctly before. Ross has been one of Australia's leading public policy thinkers in the economic arena and more broadly over the last 20 years. I think as a nation we're very privileged to have seen Ross lead a thoughtful and very thorough effort looking at climate policy that really primed the national debates in Australia, and Ross has maintained his strong intellectual and policy engagement on this issue to the benefit of us all. So Ross, it's great to have you with us tonight. Thank you so much. We're also very privileged to have Professor Robin Eckersley with us. Robin's going to speak on and focus on the outcomes of the international negotiations from a perspective of social justice implications at an international level. And I think one of the great challenges and opportunities we face in these discussions is, yes, they're about the environment, yes, they're about economics, and yes, they're about people and our future. And how do we weave these things together? So, Robin, a really warm welcome. Great to have you here tonight. We're also very fortunate to have Kane Thornton to speak from an industry perspective on what outcomes, where we're currently at and where we could go. What does this mean for investment from business? What does this mean with regard to deployment of clean technologies and a low-carbon energy future in Australia? So that's a very important perspective for our discussions as well. So, Kane, thank you very, very much to be with us. So we've got some great presentations, a panel that can really engage us in discussion. I'm very much looking forward to tonight. So will you join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Ross Garnaut. Thanks, Ross.
Thanks, Don. Very good to be here to discuss the diabolical problem. There's been much sound and fury over climate science and the Copenhagen UNFCCC meetings since just before Christmas. So much that we may need a reminder that the noise and fury have not changed the risks of dangerous climate change. On a balance of probabilities, if there were no effective global effort to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, increases in greenhouse gas emissions would generate climate change that is deeply problematic for human society. The risks are greater for Australia than other developed economies. There will be little argument with these propositions from the overwhelming weight of specialist and authoritative opinion in climate science, or from the academies of science in any of the countries of large scientific achievement. If there were a case for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in February 2009, there's a similar case in February 2010. We may also need a reminder that while the conference processes at Copenhagen were a fiasco, the international community moved closer than ever before to a strong agreement on mitigation of climate change. There was widespread support in Copenhagen, not yet an agreement, for reducing the rate of growth of greenhouse gas emissions enough to create a reasonable chance of holding the increase in average temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That would require global emissions to soon reach a peak and begin to fall, and then to be reduced by around 50% from 1990 levels by 2050. The world is a long way from agreeing on principles for allocating the required reduction in emissions entitlements across countries, and analysis and recent experience suggest that agreement is unlikely except around the principle of convergence towards equal per capita entitlements across the whole of humanity. If the world as a whole is to reduce emissions entitlements by 50% by 2050, developed countries will have to reduce them by nearly 90%. Australian emissions would have to fall by about 25% by 2020 and by about 90% by 2050. While the developing countries, and in particular China, did too little to support the emergence of international agreement at Copenhagen, they went much further in their commitments to domestic action than ever before. They actually committed themselves to domestic action that would, if implemented, make their part of an ambitious global agreement. China went further in domestic commitments than my review had calculated to be appropriate as China's contribution by 2020 to a strong global agreement. A binding international agreement on climate change mitigation would provide the framework for large emissions reductions at the lowest possible economic costs. It would allow international trade in emissions entitlements. This, in turn, would encourage the concentration of emissions reductions in countries in which they could be achieved at lowest cost and the establishment of similar emissions entitlement prices in all countries. Similar emissions prices would be crucial to avoiding costly distortion of international trading patterns. Not only would a binding international agreement provide the lowest cost path to lowering the risks of dangerous climate change to acceptable levels, but it would provide the framework for what is probably the only path. A succession of independent national measures in many countries, relying heavily on ad hoc regulatory interventions, growing larger as concern for climate change becomes more urgent, is likely in practice to be the main alternative to a global agreement on allocation of emissions entitlements. Such an alternative approach is much more likely than no intervention at all. This may turn out to be at once economically more costly and inadequate to the mitigation task. If the mainstream climate science is broadly right, the growing realisation of the realities and then the manifestation of risks as damage from climate change is likely to drive political responses and policy action. Not considered and ordered responses, not economically rational responses, but policy responses that grow more in panic and disorder the longer they are delayed. In the way of human political responses, in the absence of international agreement on principles for allocating emissions entitlements, most people in each country will judge other countries' efforts more than their own to be inadequate. This will be deeply corrosive of international cooperation in all spheres. It is likely to be associated with corrosion of international trade in goods. One way or another, Australia will come under pressure to make efforts in mitigation that others judge to be satisfactory. The pressure will be the greater because we are one of the developed countries, because we are the world's biggest exporter of coal, and because we start as the developed country with the highest per capita emissions. Australia's distinctive place on top of the per capita emissions developed country league table derives partly from energy use generally and electricity generation in particular playing an exceptionally large part in the Australian economy. It derives to a considerable extent from coal, the most emissions-intensive energy source, playing an exceptionally large part in energy and especially electricity production. Australia will not get anywhere near its necessary place in an agreed global effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, nor anywhere near others' expectations of it in an ad hoc world of national mitigation policies, without radical reductions in emissions from energy use in general and electricity generation in particular. To note the large role of energy emissions in a major Australian mitigation effort is not to talk down the importance of biological sources of emissions and biosequestration. My review said that the change in biological processes was potentially transformational in Australia's mitigation effort. The 2009 report of the CSIRO for the Queensland Government underlined its potential importance. But the amount and the cost of reductions in emissions through land use change, agriculture and forestry are highly uncertain. The means of measurement of changes in emissions from biological processes in their early development stages, and the policy instruments that will promote efficient reductions of emissions under development. These processes are an appropriate focus of major research effort, partly supported by the public finances. Identifiable reductions in emissions through these processes should attract payments comparable to those attracted by other sources of emissions reductions. Whatever the progress in biosequestration, effective Australian mitigation requires transformation of the energy sector. The required transformation is complex and demands commitments of large amounts of capital over long periods of time. There's a longer written version of what I'm saying now, which is on my website, roscarno, lowercase, no dots.com.au, and in there I go over again a lot of the material in chapter 20 called the energy transformation from the Garnaut Climate Change Review. And that material demonstrates the complexity of the adjustment task. It also demonstrates that Australia is exceptionally well placed to make the major adjustments that are required. We're well placed because we have an abundance relative to almost everywhere else per capita of all of the opportunities for producing electricity and energy with lower emissions. We're becoming the world's largest exporter of natural gas. We've got the world's largest resources of high-grade uranium oxide. We've got certainly amongst developed countries per capita, we've got by far the largest resources of solar insolation. On the southern coast and in Tasmania, we've got some of the best wind resources in the world. Much of the Australian coast has exceptional opportunity for wave power. The radioactive material in Australian rocks relatively close to the surface in a lot of the continent provides exceptional opportunity for low-cost generation of thermal electricity. One of the exciting opportunities for sequestration of carbon dioxide is through clever use and expanded use of algae for a reproduction of the biological processes that made life habitable on Earth over the thousands of millions of years. The environment that algae needs is, or in which it operates best, it has high levels of solar insolation and a saline environment, and we've got plenty of both of those things. We've got exceptional geological prospects for geosequestration, pretty close to places where we generate large amounts of electricity from fossil fuels. If there's anywhere on Earth where carbon capture and storage is going to be economic, it will be in the Bass Strait adjacent to the Latrobe Valley. So we have all of these opportunities. We don't know very clearly which of these will turn out to be most important in the Australian energy transformation. That depends on paths of technological change. Particular success of some technologies will improve the prospects of some others and weaken the prospects of others. The interactions between different sources of lower emissions technology are so complex that there is no chance that bureaucrats, no matter how clever, leaders of governments, no matter how clever, will be able to select reliably now what technologies are likely to be successful. Market processes are going to be crucial to getting good outcomes, to finding the lowest cost outcomes. And two elements in a market-based approach are essential. One is putting a similar price on carbon emissions wherever they are generated, and providing a similar value for sequestration of carbon wherever it occurs. Secondly, providing support for research, development and commercialisation of new low emissions technologies. We need them both. The first of these sets of policies, the carbon price, is necessary to counteract the external costs of one person or firm's activities on others through carbon emissions. The second is necessary to compensate for the external benefits that one firm or person's innovation provides to society as a whole. In innovation, a lot of the benefits accrue to others than those who make the investment in innovation, so we'll get too little of it, too little research, development and commercialisation of new technologies without public financial support. Well, all of this transformation is going to take place in what would be a very challenging environment, even without climate change mitigation. From the mid-1990s until around 2006, prices for both electricity and gas in Australia were generally stable. Over the past 2 years, increases in electricity prices have been much larger than for any other substantial component of the Australian Consumer Price Index, 10.2% in 2008 and 15.7% in 2009. Notified electricity prices have been set at an increase of 20.2% in New South Wales and 11.8% in Queensland for 2009-10. Victoria deregulated retail electricity prices in early 2009, so you can't point to a notified electricity price for Victoria. So far, rising prices have reflected the need to justify considerable capital expenditure in transmission and generation. This has been compounded by the effect of drought on the availability of water for hydroelectric generation and power station cooling. This is only the beginning of a new era of much higher and rising electricity prices, independently of climate change policies. The New South Wales Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal has looked ahead to the introduction of an emissions trading scheme along the lines of the draft law passed by the Australian House of Representatives, with an emissions price of $26 per tonne in 2012, and attributed more of large expected price increases to the need to recoup the cost of investment in strengthening the electricity distribution grid than to the ETS. Capital costs of new generation capacity have risen markedly, with particular impact on capital-intensive industries. Industry advice to the review indicated that there were increases of up to 60% in construction costs per installed kilowatt of power plants since 2004 across all technologies. There was no reduction in Australian costs during the global financial crisis, and costs have now resumed their steep upward march with the restoration of the strength of the resources boom. A major uplift in global coal prices, hundreds of % over the past 5 years, will flow through to the costs of New South Wales power generation as long-term contracts mature and are replaced by contracts reflecting contemporary conditions. Eastern Australia has for many years enjoyed gas prices well below international levels and has been insulated from the large recent increase in international prices by the absence of an export industry. The emergence of the gas export industry in the years immediately ahead will gradually push Eastern Australian gas to international prices. Now, these developments have nothing to do with putting a price on emissions, and they will all together lead to very large increases in electricity prices. The ETS, at the sort of level currently discussed, will add to those prices, add significantly to those prices, but the ETS effects will represent a minority of the pressures on increased electricity prices. Nevertheless, there are and will be huge opportunities for misrepresentation, and that's one burden that climate change mitigation will have to carry in the period ahead. The structure of the energy sector and the future for specific technologies, as projected in my review's modelling, are critically dependent on the assumptions of future technology developments, and these assumptions are in the nature of things crude and arbitrary, because in the nature of things you don't know where research, development and commercialisation of new technologies will take you. Put the right policies in place, provide stability in policies, and we will get the long-term and capital-intensive investment in research and in new technologies as they emerge to make the transformation happen at the lowest possible cost. Australia faces a more uncertain environment now for investment in the energy sector than at any time since early 2007. In the absence of the introduction of a price on carbon emissions, the early introduction, there is a danger that the progress that has been made within business towards forward-looking structural change will be reversed. The change is significant. When I began work on the review in 2007, I did a round of talking to people in state governments and in the energy sector about plans for the future. The standard assumption was that there would continue, the major source of new investment would be coal-based power generation. Well, that hasn't happened. The three large power stations on the drawing boards in Eastern Australia now are natural gas-based, and that's all because people came to expect a carbon price. And not only are there three gas-fired power stations on the slipway and no coal-based ones near current decisions, but they are closed-cycle gas plants which use energy more efficiently and have lower emissions, although they have higher initial capital costs. In the aluminium sector, when I began my work talking to people, there was an expectation that there would be major expansion of coal-based aluminium smelting in Australia, including in perhaps the world's most emissions-intensive coal production based on Victorian brown coal. That was all being actively discussed. It's not now, and the large aluminium companies, the big global companies, are all putting a shadow price on carbon emissions, which effectively excludes new investment in coal-based aluminium smelting. Well, that's all because there's been an expectation of a carbon price coming. If it doesn't come, we will go back into a reverse. We will start putting in place new capacity that will have to be unwound as part of Australia's future adjustment. It will be much more costly. The uncertainty exists because there seems to be no way through either in the international discussion, it seems to many people, or in the domestic politics, the stalemate between the House of Representatives and the Senate. I anticipated the possibility of a long period when there was no international agreement in my review, and said that in those circumstances we would be in what I called the waiting game. And there's a paragraph in the report that talks about policy for the waiting game, and that says legislate the ETS but fix the price. And I suggested $20 in 2005 prices, and then raise it by by inflation plus 4 percentage points per annum. There's a certain set of economic arithmetic behind that, but you wouldn't float the price and have active trade until you had an international agreement providing a sound global basis for trade in emissions. I said that in 2008. I think it's the right approach now. If we use our imaginations, I think we can see how that could possibly, in some circumstances, get through early in the life of the next Parliament, if not in this one. As I said, there's more on my website, but all of it focuses on the need to quickly put a price on carbon, create an expectation of a rising price over time. We don't have the circumstances in which the full ETS could work effectively. We don't have the current circumstances, but we could play the waiting game effectively and maintain some of the progress towards at least ceasing to be a more carbon intensive economy during the waiting game if we follow those prescriptions. Thank you.